The 3-year-old calf simply folded. Not with a struggle, not with a cry, just folded, like a sack of grain releasing its contents, and crumpled onto the dust. Amara watched her granddaughter, Kamali, the little one born during the last good rains, collapse at her mother's feet, and she felt something inside her chest break. Not metaphorically, actually break. A physical sensation of something precious shattering. It was the afternoon of the 7th day without water. The sun was directly overhead, a white ball of fury that had turned the sky into something that hurt to look at directly. The riverbed they stood in, what used to be the Kwai River, one of the most reliable water sources in the Okavango Delta, was now nothing but cracked mud, broken into 1,000 pieces like dried pottery. Not a single drop of moisture. Not a hint of life. Naledi, Kamali's mother, stood over her daughter's collapsed body and made a sound that only elephants could make, a low-frequency rumble of despair so deep that it resonated in Amara's chest like a second heartbeat. Naledi was a young cow, only 32 years old, strong and resourceful, but her strength meant nothing now. She bent her front legs and tried to encourage her daughter to stand, pressing her trunk against the calf's flank. Kamali's eyes opened, vacant, unseeing, and then closed again. Around them, the rest of the herd stood motionless in the heat. 63 elephants. 3 generations. Amara could count them without moving, could identify each one by the particular shape of their ears or the angle of their tusks or the way they stood. Her son, Timba, a 12-foot bull with tusks that gleamed even in this hellscape. Her daughters, Thembai, Zuri, and Naledi's mother Chikara. Her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. They all stood in various states of collapse, their massive bodies reduced to skin stretched over bone, their eyes dull with the kind of suffering that comes from extended deprivation. And they were all looking at her. Amara was 67 years old. She stood 9 feet 10 inches tall and weighed just over 6 tons, though the drought had taken nearly 800 pounds off her frame in the past 3 weeks. Her tusks were worn and chipped from 7 decades of use. Her skin hung on her body in places, wrinkled and thin as paper. Her ears, those magnificent evolutionary masterpieces that were supposed to dissipate heat in the African sun, now hung nearly limp from her head because she didn't even have the energy to fan them to cool herself. She looked like what she was, an animal at the end of her life, standing in a landscape that was trying its hardest to kill her. And yet every elephant in the herd was waiting to see what she would do next. Amara had been the matriarch for 31 years. She had led them through droughts and floods, through encounters with lions, and through the terrifying encounters with humans who came with guns and vehicles and a hunger for ivory that seemed to have no end. She had given birth to 7 calves and watched 3 of them grow to adulthood and watched one of them, her eldest son, Kato, die when he was only 16, killed by poachers who had wanted his tusks, which were just beginning to grow into their full magnificence. She had survived everything life had thrown at her. But standing there in that riverbed on the 7th day without water, with her youngest granddaughter collapsed and dying at her feet, with her herd looking at her with eyes that held both hope and resignation, Amara felt something she had rarely felt before: doubt. The kind of doubt that didn't whisper. It screamed. What if she had made a mistake? What if her instinct about which way to go had been wrong? What if her old body, failing and deteriorating with each passing season, could no longer be trusted to navigate? What if, after 67 years of survival, after becoming legendary among the elephants of the Okavango for her wisdom and her memory, she had finally failed? My name is Amara. Though the herd had taken to calling me she who remembers in their language, in that deep, rumbling communication that only elephants could hear. I was born in 1957 to a mother named Zara, who was herself a legendary matriarch. I have lived through 8 major droughts in my lifetime. I have given birth 7 times and buried 2 of my children. I have led my family across 2,000 miles of landscape, reading the subtle signs that told me where water would be, where danger lurked, where food could be found. I have earned my leadership not through aggression or dominance, but through the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of survival. But none of that mattered now, because in this moment, with Kamali's body unmoving in the dust, and my entire family looking to me for answers I did not have, I finally understood what it meant to reach the end of your rope, to feel the weight of a lifetime of responsibility pressing down on you all at once. To realize that wisdom, no matter how hard won, no matter how carefully accumulated, might not be enough. I turned away from my family. I turned away from the dying calf and the desperate mother and the hopeful eyes of 62 other elephants who were depending on me to lead them to salvation. And I began to walk west. Alone. I was born during the rainy season of 1957, when the Okavango Delta was at its most lush and alive. My mother, Zara, was already a matriarch at the time, a position she would hold for another 41 years until her death in 1998. She was a legendary figure even then, known throughout the entire elephant population of northern Botswana as a keeper of ancient knowledge, a keeper of routes and passages that other elephants had forgotten. My earliest memory was of my mother's trunk around my tiny body, warm and secure, pulling me close as we moved through a landscape that seemed impossibly vast. I was only a few days old, and the world was a confusion of sounds and smells and sensations that I couldn't yet parse. But my mother's touch meant safety. It meant I was part of something larger than myself. I grew up in a herd that was structured entirely around the knowledge and leadership of my mother. Every decision about where we would travel was made by her. Every conflict within the herd was resolved by her wisdom. Every young elephant in our family learned by watching her move, watching her listen, watching the way she processed information from the landscape and made decisions based on that information. This was how knowledge passed from generation to generation among elephants, not through words, but through observation and imitation. When I was 10 years old, my mother took me aside one evening, and she did something unusual. She spoke to me directly, using the low-frequency communication that only we could hear, a sound that vibrated through the earth and through our bodies simultaneously. Amara, she said, using my full name in a way that meant she was being serious. You will live a long time, longer than most elephants. I can see this in you. Your body is strong, your mind is sharp, and you carry within you a gift that is rare among our kind. You have the ability to remember, not just to remember things you have experienced, but to remember things that others have experienced and have passed to you. I listened without understanding fully what my mother meant, but I understood that something important was being transmitted. One day, she continued, you will be the matriarch of this herd, or a different herd, but somewhere, someone will be depending on you to lead them through difficult times. When that happens, I want you to remember this. Wisdom is not the same as knowledge. Knowledge is what you learn in your own lifetime. Wisdom is what you inherit from the lifetimes of those who came before you. Never trust only your own knowledge. Always consult the wisdom of your ancestors, because they have walked paths that you will walk again. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she was saying, but I never forgot the words. And as I grew older, as I experienced my first drought at age 15 and my first encounter with poachers at age 18, and my first loss at age 22 when my eldest sister was killed by lions, I began to understand what my mother had meant. I was 43 years old when my mother died. I was already a mother myself by then. I had given birth to my first calf at age 17 and had been continually pregnant or nursing ever since. My mother's death was a watershed moment in my life. Suddenly, all of the responsibility for the herd fell on me. There was no transition period. There was no gradual handoff of authority. My mother was simply gone, and I was the one who everyone looked to. The early years of my leadership were difficult. Some of the older bulls questioned my authority. Some of the younger cows didn't trust that I had the wisdom to lead them. But I had inherited my mother's knowledge, and I had also accumulated my own knowledge through my years of living. And slowly, over years and decades, I proved myself. I led them through droughts. I found water sources that other herds didn't know existed. I navigated the complex landscape of the Okavango while avoiding human encroachment and conflict with other animal species. By the time I reached my 60s, I had become legendary. Young elephants from other herds would ask to join our family just so they could travel with me and learn from me. Bulls would defer to my judgment even when their own instincts told them different. Younger matriarchs would consult me about how to handle difficult situations. I had become, in many ways, what my mother had been before me, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a repository of wisdom, a guide through the complexity of survival. But I was also old. My body was beginning to fail me in ways that no amount of wisdom could overcome. My hearing, once acute enough to detect a lion's footsteps from a mile away, was becoming dulled. My vision, which had been perfect my entire life, was now beginning to blur around the edges. My joints, which had carried me across thousands of miles of landscape, were beginning to creak and ache. I was living on borrowed time, and I knew it. My relationship with my family was complex. My children, 7 of them, though only 3 had survived to adulthood, loved me and respected me, but they also carried a certain weight of expectation. They were supposed to be strong. They were supposed to be wise. They were supposed to inherit my knowledge and carry it forward to the next generation. My grandchildren, of whom I had many, looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. I was the legend of the herd, but I was also an old woman whose body was beginning to fail. And then came the drought. The rains had failed for 18 months before we truly understood what was happening. At first, we thought it was temporary. Droughts came and went. They were part of the rhythm of life in the Okavango. You experienced a dry season, and then the rains came again. You conserved your resources, and you adapted, and you survived. But this drought was different. This drought was the kind that came perhaps once in a lifetime, or even less frequently than that. This drought was the kind that required not just adaptation, but absolute transformation of behavior and movement. It started with the smaller water sources drying up. The secondary water holes that we used during the dry season simply disappeared. We were forced to travel to the main rivers and channels that held water even during the most severe droughts. But when we arrived at these main sources, we found them already crowded with other animals. Thousands of wildebeest, hundreds of buffalo, other elephant herds, all of them desperate, all of them fighting for access to the diminishing water supply. The competition became fierce. Animals that would normally coexist began to battle for resources. We witnessed wildebeest attacking each other over access to muddy water holes. We saw buffalo goring their own kind in their desperation for moisture. The landscape became a kind of battlefield, with death stalking every creature that walked on it. My herd was not immune to this reality. During the 19th month of the drought, a young bull named Covey, my grandson, went to the river one evening to drink and was attacked by a crocodile that had become aggressive from hunger. He survived, but he was deeply wounded, and despite the efforts of the entire herd to help him, he died 2 weeks later from infection. It was one of the most difficult moments of my life as a matriarch. I could do nothing to save him. My wisdom meant nothing in the face of death. Then, a month after Covey's death, Kamali was born, the calf-born to Nality, my youngest daughter. It was a miracle that Kamali was born at all, that Nality had enough nutrition and health to carry a pregnancy, to term, and give birth. But Kamali's arrival was also a kind of cruelty. She was born into a world that had very little to offer her. Her mother was struggling to produce milk because Nality herself was starving. There were no lush plants for her to feed on as she grew older. There were no comfortable places to rest without being exposed to the elements. Still, we all celebrated her birth. Because in those dark times, a new life meant hope. It meant the herd was still capable of creating a future. But as the drought deepened and intensified, even that hope began to fade. By the time Kamali was 3 years old, the landscape had become nearly unrecognizable. The traditional water sources were drying up faster than anyone could have predicted. Other herds were dying. We would find the bodies of elephants we had known in the mud where they had collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. We would find the carcasses of countless other creatures, zebras, wildebeest, buffalo, giraffes, all of them victims of the drought. My herd was surviving, but barely. We were moving constantly, searching for water, searching for food, searching for any kind of relief from the relentless heat and the crushing pressure of survival. The younger elephants were growing weak. The calves were suffering, and I could feel time running out. Then came the morning when we arrived at what had always been our most reliable water source, the Kwai River, and found it completely dry. Not muddy, not reduced to a trickle, completely dry. And I realized, in that moment, that we had reached a point of absolute crisis. If the Kwai was dry, if the river that had never failed us in my entire lifetime was now gone, then we were in unprecedented territory. That was the day that Kamali collapsed. I stood in that dried riverbed for a long time after I walked away from my family. I stood alone, with my body screaming in pain and my mind racing with the weight of the decision I had to make. Every elephant in my herd was depending on me, and I had just walked away from them. But I hadn't walked away without direction. I had walked away with a destination. You see, there was something that I had carried with me for 40 years. Something that my mother had told me when I was in my early 20s, during the terrible drought of 1984. We had been in a situation similar to this one. The traditional water sources had failed, and the herd was desperate. My mother had gathered her strength and led us west, away from where all the other animals were going, away from the places where we had always gone, into territory that felt strange and unknown. And at the end of that journey, we had found it. A hidden spring, fed by underground water that came from somewhere deep beneath the landscape. It wasn't large, but it was enough. It was water, clean and fresh, and it had saved our lives. Before my mother died, she had sat with me and had pressed her trunk against my forehead, a gesture of transmission, of passing something sacred from one generation to the next. West, she had said, when everything else fails you, when the Okavango forgets its children, remember this, go west. There is a place there, a place where the old knowledge is still alive, a place where I found salvation, and one day, you will too. I had carried those words like a seed inside me for 4 decades. Through years of abundance and years of scarcity. Through the births of my children and the deaths of my loved ones. Through all of the droughts and all of the challenges, I had carried that single piece of knowledge, west. But west to where? I had walked west during that drought of 1984. I had followed my mother. But I had not memorized every turn, every landmark. I had memorized the feeling of the landscape. I had memorized the way the wind smelled from certain directions. I had memorized the quality of the earth beneath my feet. These things were encoded in my body, in my sensory memory, in a way that was deeper than conscious thought. When I turned away from my dying granddaughter and my desperate family, I was trusting something that I couldn't fully explain. I was trusting the wisdom of my mother, mixed with the accumulated knowledge of my own 67 years of life, mixed with the subtle signals that my body was sending me about direction and distance and the possibility of survival. I was trusting my memory. But as I walked away from the riverbed, as I moved into the unknown landscape, I also carried with me a terrible doubt. What if my memory was wrong? What if the hidden spring had dried up in the 4 decades since my mother had found it? What if the landscape had changed so much that I could no longer navigate by instinct and feeling? What if I was leading my family to death instead of salvation? I walked for 3 hours before I turned around and went back to the herd. I had made my decision, and there was no more room for doubt. I returned to find them waiting in the riverbed, exactly where I had left them. Not moving, not searching, just waiting. Waiting for their matriarch to tell them what to do next. When my son, Timba, saw me returning, he made a sound of relief that was almost painful to hear. My daughters began to move toward me, their trunks reaching out in a gesture of welcome. Even Naledi, who was still standing over her collapsed daughter, looked up with something that might have been hope in her eyes. I moved to the center of the herd, and I made an announcement in the low-frequency communication that all elephants could hear. It was a sound that came from deep in my chest, from somewhere that was older than conscious thought. We are leaving, I said. We are leaving this place. We are leaving the rivers and the channels that we have always relied on. We are going west. I do not know if the journey will be short or long. I do not know if what I remember will be accurate. But I know this, staying here means death. Moving means there is a possibility of life. There was a moment of silence. I could feel the uncertainty radiating from the herd. I could sense their fear and their desperation and their confusion about why their matriarch was asking them to leave the last place where water might still be found. Then my eldest daughter, Thembai, moved forward. She walked toward me, and she pressed her trunk against my forehead in the same gesture that my mother had used with me. It was a gesture of trust. It was a gesture of saying, I believe in you. I will follow you. Whatever happens, I will follow. One by one, the other elephants began to move. They began to gather themselves. They began to prepare for the journey. Even Kamali, the little 3-year-old who had collapsed just hours before, managed to struggle to her feet. Her mother, Naledi, was at her side, helping her up, supporting her weight. The herd was ready. And so we left the Kwai River, the place that had been a gathering ground for elephants in the Okavango Delta for thousands of years. We left behind the familiar and the known. And we walked west, toward a destination that only I could see, carrying with us only the hope that the memory of an old woman might be enough to save us. We walked through the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. The sun was descending toward the horizon when we began to move, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if the circumstances had been different. As darkness fell, the temperature began to drop, and I felt a strange relief in my aging body. The heat had been so overwhelming that even the relative coolness of evening felt like a gift. The landscape we were moving through was not completely unknown to me, but it was not familiar either. It was territory that I had passed through rarely, usually only during the worst droughts when normal routes were not available. I could feel the subtle differences in elevation beneath my feet. I could sense the direction by reading the stars, which were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. And most importantly, I could feel something else, a kind of intuitive sense of rightness, as if my body was remembering a path that my conscious mind could not quite access. Behind me, the herd followed in a loose formation. The larger adults were on the outside, providing a kind of protective barrier. The younger calves and the weaker individuals were in the middle. This was the formation we always used when we were traveling through dangerous territory. It was instinctive, something that every elephant understood without being explicitly taught. But I could sense the suffering in the herd. I could hear it in the way their feet fell on the ground, heavier than usual, more labored. I could see it in the way some of the younger elephants were moving, their bodies covered in dust, their eyes reflecting the starlight with an expression that was somewhere between resignation and desperation. The most concerning was Kamali. The little 3-year-old was moving, but only barely. She was leaning heavily against her mother, and Naledi was having to practically drag her forward. Every few steps, I could hear Naledi making soft, encouraging sounds to her daughter, trying to keep her moving, trying to sustain her will to continue. We walked through most of the night. I knew from experience that traveling at night, when the temperature was cooler and when most predators were less active, was the best way to conserve energy and avoid the worst of the heat. The night was a time when the body could tolerate movement better, even in a state of severe deprivation. Around midnight, I called for the herd to rest. We had traveled perhaps 12 miles from the riverbed, and I could sense that the younger elephants were beginning to reach the limit of what they could endure. We gathered together in a loose circle, with the adults forming the outer edges and the calves and young elephants clustered in the center. I stood watch through most of the night. This was something I had always done, even when I was younger. As matriarch, my responsibility extended even into sleep. I had to remain alert for signs of danger, predators, human encroachment, other threats. And tonight, there was another reason for my vigilance. I had to monitor the condition of my herd. I had to be able to hear if one of them was struggling too badly, if one of them was approaching the point of collapse. In the darkness, I could hear sounds all around me. The sound of heavy breathing, particularly from the older elephants and from Kamali's mother, who was struggling to maintain consciousness while remaining alert to her daughter's needs. The sound of the occasional rumble of communication between family members. The distant sounds of the African night, hyenas calling, jackals hunting, the constant chorus of insects and birds that somehow persisted even in this drought-stricken landscape. And underneath all of these sounds, something else. Something that I had become increasingly aware of over my lifetime. The sound of silence where there should be sound. The absence of running water. The absence of the normal sounds of the Okavango Delta. The rustling of reeds, the calls of water birds, the movement of fish in the rivers. The drought had done more than take away water. It had taken away the entire sonic landscape that had defined my world. As dawn began to break, I realized something that I had been avoiding confronting. We would have to walk again today. We would have to continue west without knowing how much further we had to go. And with each step, with each mile we covered, we were using up resources that we could not replace. We were consuming energy that had no source of replenishment. We were burning away the fat stores that had kept us alive through the first months of drought, and those stores were nearly depleted. I looked at my herd as the sun began to rise, and I saw the reality of our situation with clear eyes. We had perhaps 2 more days of walking in us. Maybe 3 if we were fortunate. After that, if we had not found water, if my memory had failed me, if the hidden spring my mother had spoken of no longer existed or was in a different location than I remembered, the herd would begin to die. Not all at once, but one by one, starting with the youngest and the oldest and the most vulnerable. Kamali would probably be the first. She was so young and so weak and so dependent on her mother's milk that her body would give out within hours of the water running out completely. Then the other calves. Then some of the oldest adolescents. Then, eventually, perhaps even some of the adults. I looked at Kamali, still asleep against her mother's body, and I made a decision. We would walk faster today. We would push harder. We would ignore the suffering and the pain and the desperate desire to simply lie down and rest. Because we had to reach the spring before the herd began to die. I had 2 days, perhaps 3, to find a place that I had only visited once in my entire lifetime, 40 years ago. And I was an old woman whose body was beginning to fail, walking on memory alone, trusting in a wisdom that I could not prove and could not verify. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to intensify, I gathered the herd and pointed myself west. And we walked. It was late afternoon of the second day of walking when Simba, one of the younger bulls in the herd, challenged me directly. Simba was 18 years old, which made him old enough to have opinions and young enough to believe that his opinions were worth more than they actually were. He was strong and fast, with good tusks that were still growing, and he had become increasingly confident in his own abilities over the past year. He had never been happy with my leadership, though his complaints had mostly been indirect until now. We were moving through a landscape that was becoming increasingly rocky and unfamiliar. The terrain had shifted from the relatively flat plains where we had started to something more uneven and complex. There were outcroppings of stone. There were depressions in the landscape that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. There were places where I had to stop and use my senses, my ears, my trunk, my intuition, to determine which direction to continue. To Simba and some of the other younger elephants, this must have looked like uncertainty. And in some ways, it was uncertainty. I was not completely confident about which way to go. I was relying on feeling and memory and a kind of intuitive sense that was difficult to articulate. Simba made his challenge during one of these moments of hesitation. It came in the form of a low-frequency rumble that could be heard by every member of the herd. "We should go north," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from physical strength and the arrogance of youth. The herds that survived the drought of 1992 went north. The water is flowing in the northern valleys. We are wasting time going west into empty spaces. We are going to die out here, following an old woman who doesn't even know where she's going. There was a moment of silence. I could feel the attention of the entire herd focus on me. This was a challenge to my authority, and how I responded would determine whether I maintained my leadership or whether I was going to be usurped. I did not respond immediately. I continued walking, my pace steady and deliberate, my posture upright despite the pain that was shooting through my joints with every step. I wanted to make it clear that Simba's words had not affected my direction or my purpose. But after a few minutes, I began to speak. My voice was lower than Simba's, but it carried a weight that his young voice did not possess. It was the voice of someone who had lived through things that Simba could not yet imagine. "Simba," I said, allowing my words to carry through the herd in the low-frequency communication. "You are right that you are strong. You are right that the herds that went north in 1992 were able to find water there. You have a good memory for the recent past, but you have only lived through one drought that you remember clearly. You were born in 1989, which means you were too young to have clear memories of the drought of 1984. I was there for that drought. I was there when we thought the northern valleys would have water, and I was there when we discovered that there were thousands of other animals also thinking the same thing. The water sources were overwhelmed. Chaos reigned, and elephants died." I paused, allowing this information to sink in. "You have lived 18 years, I continued. "I have lived 67. Your memory covers 18 years. My memory covers 67. And not just my memory. My mother's memory. Her mother's memory. Knowledge that has been passed down for generations. When you are asking me to trust your judgment over my own, you are asking me to discard the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime." Simba did not respond immediately. I could see the conflict in his posture. He was young and strong and had been receiving support from some of the other younger bulls. But he was also intelligent enough to understand that challenging the Matriarch was a serious matter, that the herd's unity depended on a certain level of respect for authority. Then my son, Temba, moved forward. Temba was the lead bull of the herd, a massive creature with tusks that gleamed in the afternoon light. He positioned himself between me and Simba, which was a clear gesture of support. It was also a gesture that suggested that if Simba continued to push his challenge, he might face conflict not just with the matriarch, but with the physically strongest bull in the herd. The matriarch has decided, Timba said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority as lead bull. We go west, and we will not question her judgment again. It was not quite a threat, but it was close enough that Simba understood the message. He fell back into his place in the herd, his challenge defeated but not forgotten. But I understood something in that moment that troubled me deeply. Simba's challenge would not be the last. If we did not find water soon, if the herd continued to suffer and weaken, there would be more challenges. And eventually, one of the younger bulls might be strong enough or desperate enough to actually attempt to take over. And if that happened, if my leadership was usurped, it would be catastrophic for the herd. Because without a single unified direction, the herd would fragment. And a fragmented herd, in the midst of a drought, had almost no chance of survival. I had to find that spring, and I had to find it soon. That night, as we rested under the stars, something began to shift in my awareness. The landscape was starting to look familiar in a way that I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that I recognized specific places. It was more subtle than that. It was as if the shape of the land was beginning to resonate with something deep in my memory, something that was encoded in my body and in the way that I moved through space. I began to notice things. A particular constellation of rocks that seemed to mark a boundary of some kind. A depression in the landscape that formed a distinctive shape. The way the wind was carrying scents from a particular direction. Scents that seemed to hint at something green, something alive, something other than dust and death. These were signs that my conscious mind could not fully interpret, but my body understood them. My body was remembering a journey that I had only made once before, 40 years ago. And that journey was now being recalled not through conscious memory, but through the deep, embodied memory that comes from lived experience encoded in the nervous system. I realized something important that night. My mother had not given me a map. She had not given me precise directions or landmarks that I could identify and follow. What she had given me was the experience itself. She had walked me through the landscape and had allowed my body to absorb and remember the journey. And now, 40 years later, even though my conscious mind was uncertain, my body knew the way. The next morning, I began to move with more confidence. The herd sensed this shift immediately. There was a kind of relief that seemed to move through them as they realized that their matriarch was no longer uncertain. I was moving with purpose. I was moving with the kind of certainty that comes from deep knowledge. We traveled through terrain that became increasingly complex. There were places where the ground was hard-packed earth, almost like a road that had been worn down by countless animals passing over it for generations. There were places where the landscape opened up into broad vistas and places where it narrowed down into passages between rocks. And then, in the late afternoon of the second day of our journey west, I began to smell something. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. The smell of minerals. The smell of moisture. The smell of underground water. I stopped walking, and my trunk went up into the air, testing the wind, trying to isolate the direction from which this smell was coming. Behind me, the entire herd stopped as well, sensing that something significant was happening. I turned slightly to the north and began to walk in a new direction, moving toward a rocky outcropping that was starting to become visible in the distance. And as we moved, the smell became stronger. The smell of water. The smell of life. We were close. I could feel it in my bones. After 3 days of walking through a landscape that had seemed empty and hopeless, after navigating on nothing but memory and intuition and the deep embodied knowledge that my mother had passed to me, we were approaching our destination. We walked through the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. The sun was descending toward the horizon when we began to move, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if the circumstances had been different. As darkness fell, the temperature began to drop, and I felt a strange relief in my aging body. The heat had been so overwhelming that even the relative coolness of evening felt like a gift. The landscape we were moving through was not completely unknown to me, but it was not familiar either. It was territory that I had passed through rarely, usually only during the worst droughts when normal routes were not available. I could feel the subtle differences in elevation beneath my feet. I could sense the direction by reading the stars, which were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. And most importantly, I could feel something else, a kind of intuitive sense of rightness, as if my body was remembering a path that my conscious mind could not quite access. Behind me, the herd followed in a loose formation. The larger adults were on the outside, providing a kind of protective barrier. The younger calves and the weaker individuals were in the middle. This was the formation we always used when we were traveling through dangerous territory. It was instinctive, something that every elephant understood without being explicitly taught. But I could sense the suffering in the herd. I could hear it in the way their feet fell on the ground. Heavier than usual, more labored. I could see it in the way some of the younger elephants were moving, their bodies covered in dust, their eyes reflecting the starlight with an expression that was somewhere between resignation and desperation. The most concerning was Kamali. The little 3-year-old was moving, but only barely. She was leaning heavily against her mother, and Naledi was having to practically drag her forward. Every few steps, I could hear Naledi making soft, encouraging sounds to her daughter, trying to keep her moving, trying to sustain her will to continue. We walked through most of the night. I knew from experience that traveling at night, when the temperature was cooler and when most predators were less active, was the best way to conserve energy and avoid the worst of the heat. The night was a time when the body could tolerate movement better, even in a state of severe deprivation. Around midnight, I called for the herd to rest. We had traveled perhaps 12 miles from the riverbed, and I could sense that the younger elephants were beginning to reach the limit of what they could endure. We gathered together in a loose circle, with the adults forming the outer edges and the calves and young elephants clustered in the center. I stood watch through most of the night. This was something I had always done, even when I was younger. As Matriarch, my responsibility extended even into sleep. I had to remain alert for signs of danger, predators, human encroachment, other threats. And tonight, there was another reason for my vigilance. I had to monitor the condition of my herd. I had to be able to hear if one of them was struggling too badly, if one of them was approaching the point of collapse. In the darkness, I could hear sounds all around me. The sound of heavy breathing, particularly from the older elephants and from Kamali's mother, who was struggling to maintain consciousness while remaining alert to her daughter's needs. The sound of the occasional rumble of communication between family members. The distant sounds of the African night, hyenas calling, jackals hunting, the constant chorus of insects and birds that somehow persisted even in this drought-stricken landscape. And underneath all of these sounds, something else. Something that I had become increasingly aware of over my lifetime. The sound of silence where there should be sound. The absence of running water. The absence of the normal sounds of the Okavango Delta. The rustling of reeds, the calls of water birds, the movement of fish in the rivers. The drought had done more than take away water. It had taken away the entire sonic landscape that had defined my world. As dawn began to break, I realized something that I had been avoiding confronting. We would have to walk again today. We would have to continue west without knowing how much further we had to go. And with each step, with each mile we covered, we were using up resources that we could not replace. We were consuming energy that had no source of replenishment. We were burning away the fat stores that had kept us alive through the first months of drought, and those stores were nearly depleted. I looked at my herd as the sun began to rise, and I saw the reality of our situation with clear eyes. We had perhaps 2 more days of walking in us, maybe 3 if we were fortunate. After that, if we had not found water, if my memory had failed me, if the hidden spring my mother had spoken of no longer existed or was in a different location than I remembered, the herd would begin to die. Not all at once, but one by one, starting with the youngest and the oldest and the most vulnerable. Kamali would probably be the first. She was so young and so weak and so dependent on her mother's milk that her body would give out within hours of the water running out completely. Then the other calves. Then some of the oldest adolescents. Then, eventually, perhaps even some of the adults. I looked at Kamali, still asleep against her mother's body, and I made a decision. We would walk faster today. We would push harder. We would ignore the suffering and the pain and the desperate desire to simply lie down and rest. Because we had to reach the spring before the herd began to die. I had 2 days, perhaps 3, to find a place that I had only visited once in my entire lifetime, 40 years ago. And I was an old woman whose body was beginning to fail, walking on memory alone, trusting in a wisdom that I could not prove and could not verify. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to intensify, I gathered the herd and pointed myself west. And we walked. The first thing I did after ensuring that the herd had drunk their fill was to assess the condition of every member of my family. I moved through them systematically, checking their physical condition, looking for signs of permanent damage from the 3 days of extreme deprivation and the forced march. Most were in better condition than I had feared. The water had restored them in ways that were almost miraculous. Already, some of the younger elephants who had seemed close to death were beginning to show signs of recovery. Their eyes were becoming clearer. Their movements were becoming more fluid and less labored. The immediate crisis had passed, but there were concerns. Kamali, though she was recovering, was still weak. The little 3-year-old would need time to fully regain her strength. Several of the oldest members of the herd, including my oldest living sister, a cow named Akila who was in her early 60s, had suffered damage that might be permanent. She was moving more slowly than before, and her breathing was more labored. I suspected that the extreme stress of the drought and the forced march had aged her significantly, and I had to confront the reality of my own physical condition. I had used up reserves that I would probably never fully replace. The 3-day journey had taken something out of me that my aging body could not easily recover. I could feel it in the way my joints ached. I could feel it in the tremor that was now permanent in my back legs. I could feel it in the way that even standing still for more than a few minutes required conscious effort. But despite my physical deterioration, I felt something else that was more important than the pain. I felt vindication. I felt the weight of proving that wisdom mattered, that memory mattered, that the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime could overcome the present moment's desperation. Simba approached me on the second day after we arrived at the spring. He approached slowly and with a kind of deference that had not been present before our journey. His entire demeanor had changed. The confidence and arrogance of youth had been tempered by the reality of survival that only the journey could teach. "Grandmother," he said, using a title that he had never used before. "I was wrong. Your memory was right. You knew the way when none of us believed you knew." I looked at this young bull, this creature who had challenged me only days before, and I saw in him the possibility of future leadership. I saw in him someone who had learned the most important lesson that life could teach, that wisdom is not arrogance, and that trust is sometimes the only thing that stands between survival and death. "You were not wrong to question," I said to him. "You were young and you were uncertain, which is what youth is. What matters is what you learn from the experience. You have learned, in 3 days, something that takes most elephants years to understand. You have learned that there are forms of knowledge that cannot be immediately verified, but which must be trusted. That is a profound lesson." Simba stood quietly for a moment, and then he pressed his trunk against my forehead in a gesture of respect and contrition. Over the next week, the herd slowly began to recover. We stayed at the spring, drinking deeply, allowing our bodies to begin to repair themselves. I sent out scouts to search for food sources near the spring. The drought meant that vegetation was scarce, but there were still some trees that had managed to survive, and we were able to gather enough leaves and bark to provide sustenance. My daughters began to take on more responsibilities. I found myself spending more time resting and less time making constant decisions. This was partly because I was exhausted, but it was also a deliberate choice. I was beginning to prepare the herd for a time when I would no longer be the matriarch. I was beginning the process of transferring power. Thembai, my eldest daughter, showed the most aptitude for leadership. She was already making decisions about how to organize the foraging, about how to manage conflicts within the herd, about how to structure our time at the spring. I began to consult with her more, to ask her opinions about important decisions, to allow her to see the kinds of thinking that went into running a family of 63 elephants. Naledi, my youngest daughter, was showing different kinds of strengths. She was remarkably nurturing and protective, particularly with the youngest calves. She had an intuitive sense of when individuals were struggling and needed support. This kind of emotional intelligence was as important as strategic thinking, and I recognized that Naledi would likely become an important counselor and healer for the herd. My son, Timba, was becoming even more confident in his role as lead bull. He had proven his loyalty to me during Simba's challenge, and that loyalty had been rewarded with continued respect from the herd. But more than that, I could see that he was beginning to understand something crucial, that physical strength and leadership were not the same thing. That true power came from the ability to support the matriarch's decisions and to implement them effectively. On the 10th day after we arrived at the spring, I did something that I had never done before. I gathered the younger members of the herd, the ones who would eventually become leaders themselves, and I began to teach them explicitly about the landscape and about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations. This was unusual. Normally, knowledge was transferred through observation and imitation, not through direct instruction. But I was aware of my own mortality in a way that I had never been before. I was aware that I might not have many more years to live, and I wanted to ensure that the most crucial knowledge did not die with me. I took Thembai, Simba, my grandson Covey, and several other younger elephants with strong aptitude, and I began to teach them about memory and landscape. Memory is not a single thing, I told them as we stood by the spring. It is not something that you can point to and say there it is. Memory is distributed across your entire body. It lives in the way your feet know a path. It lives in the way your trunk can read the air and extract information. It lives in your bones and your muscles and in patterns of behavior that have been passed down for generations. I had them place their trunks on the ground and feel the vibrations that traveled through the earth. The landscape speaks to those who know how to listen, I continued. Every rock, every depression, every change in elevation. These all communicate information if you know what you are listening for. Learn to read this language, and you will never be lost. Over the next week, I took them on walks around the immediate area of the spring, showing them how to read the signs that the landscape was offering. I showed them how to follow a scent on the wind. I showed them how to read the behavior of other animals to understand where water might be located or where danger might lie. But more than just teaching them practical survival skills, I was teaching them something deeper. I was teaching them that wisdom comes from paying attention, that leadership comes from listening to both the land and to the needs of your family. That survival, in its deepest sense, is not about individual strength, but about the ability to draw upon collective knowledge and to transmit that knowledge forward. Thembai proved to be the most apt student. She absorbed everything I taught her with a kind of hunger that suggested she understood that she was being prepared for a role that would eventually be hers. She asked intelligent questions. She made connections between different pieces of information. She began to develop her own theories about how the landscape worked and how knowledge could be extracted from it. One afternoon, as we were walking near the spring, Thembai asked me a question that revealed how deeply she had been thinking about our journey. "Mother," she said, "how did you know that we would find the spring? In those moments when you were uncertain, when you were walking on faith rather than knowledge, what kept you moving forward?" I considered the question carefully. It was a profound question, one that got at the heart of what it meant to be a leader in uncertain times. "There are two kinds of certainty," I said to my daughter. "The first kind is certainty based on information. You have all the facts. You know exactly what will happen if you take a particular action. This is a pleasant kind of certainty, but it is rare in life. The second kind of certainty is based on faith. It is based on the accumulated wisdom of those who came before you. It is based on the recognition that your own knowledge, limited as it is, can be supplemented and supported by the knowledge of your ancestors." I paused, watching her process this. "What kept me moving forward," I continued, "was not certainty about the outcome. It was trust in the knowledge that my mother had given me. And trust, I have learned, is sometimes the most important thing that any leader can offer their family. Because trust is what holds a group together when information fails and knowledge runs out." On the 15th day after we arrived at the spring, my oldest living sister, Akila, died. She had been struggling since the forced march, her body unable to fully recover from the extreme deprivation. But I had hoped, in a way that was perhaps not realistic, that she might have more time, that the water and the rest and the reduced stress would be enough to allow her to continue living. But age catches up with all of us eventually, and the drought, combined with the forced march, had simply accelerated the inevitable. I was with her when she died. I sat by her side through the night, my trunk occasionally touching her forehead in a gesture that was both comfort and farewell. She was unconscious for most of that night, her breathing becoming slower and shallower as the hours passed. In the hours before dawn, her breathing stopped, and my sister, who had lived for 64 years and who had been part of my family for my entire life, was gone. When the rest of the herd discovered her death, there was a period of mourning. This was something that other species did not always understand, that elephants mourned. that we experienced grief and loss and the recognition that something precious had been taken from us. My other sister, a cow named Zuri who was in her early 50s, stood over Akila's body and made sounds of such profound sorrow that I had to turn away. We held a vigil for Akila for several hours. Every member of the herd came and touched her body with their trunk, paying their respects, acknowledging her passing. And when it was finally time to leave her body, we did so with the understanding that she would become part of the landscape itself, would nourish the soil and the vegetation, and would, in a very real sense, continue to support the family that she had been part of for 64 years. But even in the grief of Akila's death, I saw something important. I saw that the herd was stable. I saw that even in loss, we were able to maintain our cohesion and our purpose. I saw that the wisdom of family and community was strong enough to withstand death and loss and all of the other challenges that life threw at us. That night, after the vigil was complete, I called Thembai to me. "Your aunt's death is a reminder," I said to my daughter, "of something that is easy to forget. Nothing lasts forever. We are all temporary. What matters is not how long we live, but what we do with the time that we are given. What knowledge do we pass on? What difference do we make in the lives of those around us? Your Aunt Akila lived to be 64. That is a good life, a long life. But what made her life meaningful was not its length, but its depth. The relationships she formed, the family that she was part of, the way she cared for younger members of the herd." Thembai listened quietly, and I could see that the death of her aunt was affecting her, was making her think about the fragility of life and the importance of legacy. "I am teaching you everything that I know," I continued, "because I understand that my time is limited. I do not know how much longer I will live, but I want to ensure that when I am gone, the knowledge that I have accumulated does not die with me. It lives on in you. It lives on in Simba and Covey and all of the younger elephants who are learning from me. That is how a family survives, Thembai. Not through individual immortality, but through the transmission of knowledge across generations." On the 28th day after we arrived at the spring, something miraculous happened. Clouds began to gather on the horizon. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me, that my aging vision was playing tricks on me. But then I smelled it. The smell of rain. The smell of moisture in the air. The smell of life returning. The entire herd sensed it at the same moment. There was a kind of electric excitement that ran through us. We moved away from the spring and up to a higher elevation so that we could see the sky more clearly. And then the rain began. It was not a downpour. It was not the kind of rain that would end the drought in a single afternoon. But it was real rain, real moisture falling from the sky. And as it fell, I could see the entire landscape beginning to respond. The ground was drinking in every drop. The vegetation was beginning to perk up, responding to the presence of water after so many months of deprivation. The herd began to move, not in panic, but in a kind of joyful energy that had been absent for so long. The younger elephants began to play, actually play, for the first time in months. Kamali, the 3-year-old who had nearly died during our forced march, was trumpeting with what could only be described as joy. Over the next week, the rain continued to fall intermittently. The landscape was transforming before our eyes. Grass was beginning to emerge from the ground. The trees were beginning to produce new leaves. The river channels were beginning to flow again, slowly at first, but with increasing force as more rain fell. The drought was not over. It would take weeks and months of rain to fully restore the landscape to health. But the worst of it had passed. We had survived. My family had survived. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations had proven itself to be true and reliable. On the day that the Kwai River began to flow again, that same river that had been completely dry when we left it, I led the herd back to the traditional water sources. The journey back was much faster than the journey west had been, because now we knew where we were going and because the landscape was beginning to recover its vitality. When we arrived at the Kwai River, we found it running clear and clean, the water flowing from upstream sources that had finally received enough rain to become active again. Other herds were already there, gathered to drink and to celebrate the return of life to the landscape. Word of our survival and our journey west spread through the elephant population of the Okavango Delta. Other matriarchs began to approach me with questions about where we had gone, how we had survived, what knowledge we possessed that had allowed us to overcome the drought when other herds were suffering and dying. I found myself becoming a kind of elder to the entire elephant population of the region. Young matriarchs who were facing droughts of their own would seek me out and ask me for advice. Young bulls who were developing leadership skills would observe me and try to learn from my example. This recognition was bittersweet. I was proud that I had been able to help, that my knowledge and experience were valuable to the broader elephant community. But I was also aware that this recognition was a reflection of my age and my approaching mortality. I was becoming a repository of knowledge precisely because everyone understood that I did not have much longer to live. I spent more time now with Thembai, deliberately transferring my responsibilities to her. When other matriarchs came to ask me questions, I would have Thembai respond to those questions with my guidance. When young bulls came to observe leadership, I would have Thembai demonstrate the skills and the thinking that went into making decisions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the leadership of the herd was shifting from me to her. This was as it should be. This was how knowledge and power were supposed to pass between generations. One day, about 4 months after we arrived at the spring, Thembai approached me with a formal request. This was something she had never done before, and I could sense that whatever she wanted to say was important. "Mother," she said, using a tone of voice that indicated she was speaking as a leader, not just as a daughter. "I want to propose that we establish a new protocol. I want any younger elephant who shows aptitude for leadership to be formally trained in the knowledge that has been passed down to you. I want to create a kind of school where this knowledge is explicitly taught rather than just implicitly observed." I considered this proposal carefully. It was a significant innovation. Traditionally, elephant knowledge was transferred through observation and imitation, not through formal instruction. But I also understood that Thembai was proposing something that could be crucially important for the survival of the entire elephant population. "This is a good proposal," I said to my daughter. "In fact, I think it is an essential proposal. Our landscape is changing. Our world is changing. Droughts are becoming more severe and more unpredictable. The knowledge that was sufficient for previous generations may not be sufficient for future generations. By creating a formal system of knowledge transfer, you are ensuring that our family will have the best possible chance of adapting to these new challenges." I paused, and then I said something that I had never said before. "I am ready to step down as matriarch," I said. "I am ready to transfer full leadership to you. You have proven yourself to be wise and capable. You have learned the lessons that life has to teach. And you have the vision and the energy to lead the herd into the future in ways that I can no longer do." Thembai stood very still for a moment, processing what I had just said. And then she pressed her trunk against my forehead, a gesture that I had used with her countless times in her life, but which now meant something different. Now it meant the passing of power. Now it meant that she was ready to be the matriarch of the herd. Being an elder was different from being a matriarch. As a matriarch, I had held the ultimate responsibility for the herd's survival. Every decision was mine. Every outcome, good or bad, was ultimately my responsibility. The weight of this had been constant and sometimes crushing. As an elder, my responsibilities were reduced, but in many ways deeper. I became a keeper of history. I became a teacher. I became a source of wisdom that Thembai and the other leaders could consult when faced with difficult decisions. I spent my days sitting by the water sources, watching the younger elephants, observing their development, occasionally offering guidance when it seemed appropriate. I spent time with the very young calves, telling them stories about the drought and about the journey west, helping them understand the history of their family and the knowledge that had allowed us to survive. Kamali, the little 3-year-old who had been on the edge of death during our forced march, became particularly close to me. She would often come and sit beside me, her small frame leaning against my leg, and I would tell her stories. "Why did you know where the water was, grandmother?" she asked me one day as we sat by the spring. "My mother told me," I said. "My mother walked this path, and she remembered it, and she gave me that memory as a gift." "Will you give me a memory?" Kamali asked. I considered this question carefully. It was a profound question, one that spoke to the deepest purpose of being an elder. "Yes," I said finally. "I will give you many memories. The memory of this drought and how we survived it. The memory of your mother's courage in carrying you forward when you were weak. The memory of the spring and how my mother's knowledge led us to it. All of these memories will become part of you, and one day, when you are old and wise, you will pass them on to your own grandchildren." This was how knowledge survived across generations. not through writing or through any external storage system, but through the living memory of elephants, passed from one individual to another, carried in the body and in the nervous system and in the deep places where experience is stored. 6 months after I stepped down as Matriarch, Thembai and I had a conversation that crystallized everything that had happened over the past year. We were standing at the edge of the Kwai River, watching the water flow. The landscape had fully recovered from the drought. The vegetation was lush and green. The herds were recovering their numbers. Life was abundant again. "Do you regret stepping down?" Thembai asked me. It was a question that I had not expected, but one that I had been thinking about myself. "No," I said truthfully, "but I do miss some things. I miss the clarity of purpose that came with being Matriarch. I miss the responsibility and the power of that position." "You can have a different kind of purpose now," Thembai said. "You are teaching in ways that are deeper than any teaching you did as Matriarch. The school that I have established, the formal training of young leaders, that came from your suggestion. The way that we now explicitly pass on knowledge to younger generations, that came from your influence. You are shaping the future of this herd in ways that will extend far beyond your lifetime." I looked at my daughter with something approaching awe. She had understood, almost immediately, something that had taken me decades to learn. That power is not always about control, and that influence can be more powerful than authority. "I have been thinking about the knowledge that you have taught me," Thembai continued, "and I have realized something important. The spring that we found during the drought, that spring did not just save our family. It has implications that extend far beyond us. Other herds could benefit from this knowledge. Other matriarchs could learn about the hidden springs and the water sources that they do not currently know about." "Yes," I said, "that is true. I want to propose something," Thembai said. "I want to invite matriarchs from other herds to come and learn about the route west and the location of the spring. I want to ensure that this knowledge is shared across the entire elephant population of the Okavango." I felt something shift inside my chest as I listened to my daughter speak. She had grasped something that was profoundly important. That knowledge that was hoarded was knowledge that was wasted. That true wisdom involved sharing knowledge so that others could benefit from it. "This is exactly what a great matriarch would do," I said to Thembai. "You understand that your responsibility is not just to your own family, but to the broader community of elephants. This is a wisdom that transcends any individual herd or any individual lineage." Over the next few months, we did exactly what Thembai had proposed. We invited matriarchs from other herds to come and learn about the hidden spring and the route west. We taught them the techniques for reading the landscape and for using memory and intuition to navigate toward water sources even when traditional ones were not available. Some of this knowledge was information about the physical landscape, but more of it was about the deeper skill: how to use embodied memory, how to trust in the wisdom of ancestors, how to read signs that could not be explicitly articulated but had to be felt and sensed and understood through long experience. 1 year after we found the hidden spring, I was approached by a young matriarch named Callie. She was the leader of a herd that occupied territory to the south of ours. She came to me with a request. "Elder Amara," she said, using the title that had become common among the younger elephant leaders, "I want to tell you something. My herd survived a drought that would have killed us because we had learned the knowledge that you had shared with us. We knew about the hidden springs. We knew how to read the landscape for signs of water. Because of this knowledge, we are still alive. Because of you, my children will live to have children of their own." I stood quietly for a moment, processing what this young matriarch was telling me. I realized, in that moment, that I had accomplished something that I had not consciously aimed for. I had created something that would outlive me. The knowledge that I carried, the wisdom that had been passed down to me from my mother and from her mother before her, was now spreading through the entire elephant population of the Okavango. When I was a young elephant, my purpose was to survive. When I was a matriarch, my purpose was to keep my family alive. But now, as an elder, my purpose had shifted again. My purpose was to ensure that the knowledge that had allowed me to survive would be preserved and would spread and would continue to save lives long after I was gone. This realization was both humbling and deeply satisfying. I began to notice changes in how I was treated by the younger elephants. Where once they had feared me as an authority figure, they now approached me with a kind of reverence. Not the reverence given to a leader, but the reverence given to something sacred, something that carried the weight of history and wisdom. As I entered my 70s, I became increasingly aware of my own mortality. My body was failing me in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. My back legs were becoming less reliable. My vision had deteriorated further. My hearing, once so acute, was now quite diminished. But my mind remained clear, and I was determined to use whatever time I had left to pass on the most crucial lessons, the deepest wisdom that I had accumulated over more than 7 decades of life. I spent time with Kamali, who was now becoming a beautiful young adult. I taught her not just about survival, but about what it meant to be in relationship with the landscape, to be part of something that was larger than yourself. The Okavango Delta is not just a place where we live, I told her. It is a living being itself. It breathes. It has seasons and rhythms and patterns of life and death and rebirth. When we understand ourselves as part of that larger organism, we stop seeing survival as something we do to the landscape, and we start seeing it as something we do with the landscape. That is when we become truly wise. I spent time with Thembai, discussing the challenges of leadership that she was facing. She came to me with questions about conflict resolution, about how to maintain the unity of the herd when there were members who disagreed about direction and strategy. Leadership is not about always being right, I told her. It is about holding the space where disagreement can be processed and where the community can come to a unified decision. The younger bulls will always question the matriarch. This is natural and healthy. What matters is how you respond to that questioning. Respond with anger, and you create resentment. Respond with wisdom, and you create respect. I spent time with Simba, who was now beginning to show signs of becoming a great bull himself. He had incorporated the lessons from the forced march into his identity. He had become one of the strongest protectors of the herd, but he had also become someone who understood that physical strength was not the highest form of power. "You challenged me during the drought," I said to him one day. "Do you remember?" "Yes, grandmother," he said, his eyes showing what appeared to be shame at the memory. "I was foolish and arrogant." "You were young," I corrected him, "and you asked a reasonable question. The question you asked was wrong, but the act of asking was right. The mistake was not in questioning. The mistake was in being unwilling to follow when the matriarch made her decision. Remember that, Simba. A good leader is willing to challenge when they believe they are right, but they are also willing to follow when they have been overridden. They understand that the unity of the group is sometimes more important than the correctness of any individual perspective." One night, lying by the water, I had a dream. It was one of those dreams that felt more real than reality, the kind of dream where the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes unclear. In the dream, I was young again. My body was strong and my vision was clear, and I was walking across the landscape with my mother by my side. We were walking west, toward the hidden spring, and as we walked, I could see the route crystallizing in front of us, becoming visible in a way that it had not been when I first walked it in the drought of 1984. My mother was showing me something. She was showing me how the knowledge that had been passed to her was now becoming part of me. She was showing me that the transmission of wisdom was not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, something that continued to unfold across time. And then the dream shifted. I was old again, but I was standing on a high ground, looking down at the landscape. And I could see, spread out before me, dozens of herds of elephants, all of them moving with confidence and purpose through the landscape. And I understood, in that dream vision, that all of these herds were moving with the knowledge that I had helped to transmit. All of them had learned the lessons of survival that my family had discovered. When I woke from the dream, it was dawn. The sun was beginning to rise over the Okavango Delta, and the landscape was emerging from darkness into light. And I felt a profound sense of peace. I understood that my work was not finished, but it was established. The foundation had been laid for knowledge to continue to spread and for wisdom to continue to guide the elephant population of the Okavango. 2 years after we found the hidden spring, I was approached by Thembai with a proposal that brought the full circle of succession to completion. "Mother," she said. She still called me mother even though she was now the full matriarch, and I had become known as the elder. "I want to establish a formal ceremony. A ceremony where you officially pass the title of elder to me, and where I acknowledge you as the keeper of our deepest wisdom. I want all the herds in this region to know that you are not just a former matriarch, but the repository of our collective memory and knowledge." I was moved by this proposal. It represented a crystallization of everything that had happened, the transformation of the role of elder from something that was informal and undefined to something that was formal and recognized. The ceremony took place at the hidden spring. Matriarchs from 7 different herds came to witness it. My children and grandchildren and the entire herd gathered around the spring. And in front of all of them, Thembai formally acknowledged me as the elder of the Okavango, the keeper of ancestral wisdom, the one who carried the knowledge that had allowed our people to survive. It was a simple ceremony, but a profound one. There were no words spoken except for Thembai's formal acknowledgement. But there were gestures. Each matriarch who attended came forward and pressed her trunk against my forehead, a gesture of respect and of requesting access to the wisdom that I carried. After the ceremony, as the sun was setting and the other herds were beginning to depart, I stood by the spring with Thembai and watched the water flowing. The drought seemed like something that had happened in another lifetime, though it had only been 2 years ago. Do you think the knowledge will survive? Thembai asked me. After you are gone, do you think that the matriarchs will continue to remember what you have taught them? The knowledge will survive, I said with certainty. Because you are going to ensure that it survives. You are going to teach it to the next generation, and they will teach it to the generation after that. That is how wisdom survives, Thembai. Not through any individual elephant, but through the chain of transmission that connects one generation to the next. I lived for 3 more years after the ceremony at the hidden spring. 3 years of watching my family thrive. 3 years of seeing my grandchildren grow into young adults. 3 years of observing Thembai became one of the greatest matriarchs the Okavango had ever known. In those 3 years, I saw something that validated everything I had believed, everything I had taught, everything I had fought for during that desperate journey west. The drought returned, not as severe as the previous one, but significant enough to test the knowledge that had been transmitted. And when it came, there was no panic, no desperation like there had been before. The herds knew what to do. They knew about the hidden springs. They knew how to read the landscape for signs of water. They knew how to trust in the wisdom of ancestors even when the present moment seemed uncertain. Kamali, now a young adult, came to me just before I died. She sat beside me as I lay by the water, my body finally giving out, my time in this world reaching its completion. Grandmother, she said, I want you to know something. I have learned all the lessons you taught me. I have learned how to read the landscape. I have learned how to trust in memory. I have learned how to survive. That is good, Kamali, I said. My voice was weak now, barely audible. And one day, when you are old and wise, you will teach these lessons to your own grandchildren. And they will teach it to their grandchildren. That is how we survive. Not as individuals, but as a family, as a species, as part of something that is larger than any of us. But what if I forget? Kamali asked. What if I forget the things you taught me? You will not forget, I said with the certainty of someone who has lived 70 years and seen the power of transmitted knowledge. Because you do not just carry my words, Kamali. You carry my experience. You carry the memory of the drought and the journey and the discovery of the spring. These things live in your body. They live in the way you move and the way you sense the world. You cannot forget them because they are not information that sits in your mind. They are part of who you are. As I lay there, watching the sun set over the Okavango Delta for what I knew would be one of the last times, I thought about the arc of my life. I thought about my mother and how she had passed her knowledge to me. I thought about the journey west and how it had tested everything I believed in. I thought about the hidden spring and how it had validated not just my memory, but the entire system of knowledge transmission that had sustained our people for generations. I thought about Thembai and how she had taken the mantle of leadership and had transformed it. I thought about Simba and how he had learned humility from his challenged authority. I thought about Kamali and how she carried forward the knowledge that had been accumulated across centuries. And I realized, in those final moments, that I had accomplished everything that my mother had asked me to accomplish. I had been a keeper of knowledge. I had been a guide through uncertainty. I had found a way to survive when survival seemed impossible. And most importantly, I had passed on the wisdom that had sustained me, so that it would continue to sustain others long after I was gone. My breathing slowed. My heart, which had carried me for 70 years across thousands of miles of African landscape, began to slow its rhythm. And as darkness began to close in around me, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not sadness, but completion. A sense that the work that I had been born to do had been done. The last thing I heard, before the darkness became complete, was the sound of my family around me. The low-frequency rumbles of communication between family members. The calls of the younger elephants. The breathing of creatures who would continue on after I was gone, carrying with them the knowledge and the wisdom that had shaped my entire life. And I understood, finally, that I would not truly die, because my knowledge would live on. My wisdom would live on. The memory of my journey, the lessons I had learned, the path I had walked, all of it would continue to guide the elephants of the Okavango for generations to come. Generations. That was the real measure of a life. Not the years that you lived, but the number of generations whose lives you had shaped. Not the achievements you accomplished in your own lifetime, but the foundation you laid for others to build upon. My name was Amara. I was the one who was called She Who Remembers. And my remembering had not been in vain. It had saved my family. It had saved other families. And it would continue to save families yet unborn, families that would never know my name, families whose survival would depend on knowledge that I had transmitted across time. As my life came to an end, there was peace. The peace that comes from a life fully lived, from a journey completed, from wisdom successfully transmitted. And somewhere in the African night, a young elephant, perhaps my great-granddaughter, looked at the stars and felt, in a way she could not explain, that the knowledge she carried was both ancient and new, tested and proven, fragile and eternal. The memory of one old elephant had saved generations. And the journey west, the desperate 3-day march through a drought-stricken landscape, had become part of the folklore of the Okavango, a story that would be told and retold, embodied and reenacted, remembered and lived by elephants for centuries to come. Moral message. Some wisdom can only be earned through decades of living, and its true power lies not in what it saves today, but in what it continues to save tomorrow.